And we also we take the events and we take frequently asked questions from our events, and we also post those on the event page. So please do, after the event, follow up and have a look at what we do have on the page. So I'm delighted today to be hosting Professor Mervyn King himself. He established the Good Governance Academy in March 2019. We are a non-profit organization that collaborates globally to share information on critical governance, sustainability, corporate reporting, and generally business science issues. We align with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, 4, quality education, and 17, collaboration. Today, the Good Governance Academy has established itself as a source of thought leadership for directors, executives, professionals, and academics from all over the world. The Good Governance Academy has earned its reputation for content excellence while remaining deeply relevant to the world's changing business environment. And today is no exception. Today, we are launching the first in our series of Taking the Helm, where Professor Mervyn King will take us through his experience of being a chair on boards and specific items that we're going to be discussing today. So good morning to everybody. Please use the chat functions. Lovely to see people from Qatar, from Mozambique, from South Africa, from all over the world. Lovely to see you, and welcome to the Good Governance Academy again. If you have any questions for Prof. King, we're going to treat today as a fireside chat. We'd love to bring you into the fireside with us. So please ask your questions in the Q&A so I can very quickly pick them up, and we can. And yes, thank you for your reactions. Lovely. The reactions are available. You're welcome to download the transcript. You can under the show captions also take a transcript. But as I said, we will be saving this to the event page. So join us on the event page afterwards. But first of all, welcome to Professor King, and welcome to everybody online. And today we're going to be talking about the new board agenda. But the first thing I'd like to get right is, what is the role of the chair in setting a board agenda? So Prof, if you can impart some wisdom on that for us.
Well, wisdom with experience, Karen. So I'll talk from experience. In setting the agenda for the board meeting, my experience has taught me that I talk to the senior management. So, for example, the group chief executive, the chief financial officer or chief value officer, depending what we've been thinking about. And if there's not a chief value officer, then I would certainly talk to the chief financial officer, the chief sustainability officer, and the chief information officer. Critical today on the question of, for example, AI. And of course, the company secretary who's going to put all this together. The importance of a pre-meeting is to actually learn from senior management what's happened from the previous board meeting to the board meeting we're about to have, and to make sure that the critical issue that one or other of them raises with me is set down on the agenda for that day. And the next thing to discuss with them is the minutes of the previous meeting, which I would have approved of and edited before they went out, is the action taken. What have you done? And how have you done it? And if necessary, that of course is an agenda item, what action has happened. But there might be specific issues that arise that you would make it a separate agenda item. Then there's two words, conformance and performance. So you deal with each of these senior management executives I've been talking about. A lot of them would, of course, be executive directors as well. and you deal with the critical issues of conformance, things that the company has to do as a matter of law. How have we done with compliance issues? And then performance, have we created value in a sustainable way? And not forgetting that value creation also embraces preservation and erosion, and actually raise the question of, well, the natural asset we're using is coconut oil. I believe there's a shortage of coconuts in the world today. And so what are you doing about sourcing this? And then a critical question to discuss with these senior management people is the sourcing of information, and is it auditable information? And especially with sustainability reporting, certainly over the next 2 years, my view is that globally it will be mandatory, and it's just a question of which standard. And you need to discuss that and find out what, in regard to assets, are they being eroded, preserved, or are we actually creating value? And when you've got that, you can start putting your agenda together. Then I'm going to just go a bit further, then we can discuss it. Today, in setting an agenda, I would be very mindful of things which were never thought of 5 years ago. For example, stakeholder relationships. Stakeholder relationships is a critical issue, especially your important stakeholders, which you would have identified before. And your relationship with your stakeholders is an ongoing thing on a daily basis. And if something has happened to make one stakeholder unhappy about something, well, you need to put that on the agenda and correct it within the context of the characteristics of the company. Now, I've always separated the question of culture and characteristics. Culture is an internal thing, how we do things around here when no one is watching us. But from the outside looking in, they see the characteristics of the company, and the external people, start drawing conclusions. Is this company really a good corporate citizen? And something could have happened to dent those characteristics. So Adrian Cadbury, when he was still alive, he and I had many discussions about this, that culture is really an internal thing, whereas characteristics of a company. So I've got a South African culture, but I've got characteristics the same as you, Carolyn. And it's those characteristics that sometimes are very important in running the business of the company. So if something has happened in regard to characteristics, it should become an agenda item, that sort of thing. Then, because we've moved away from the primacy of the shareholder to this value creation model, inputs to outcomes are critical issues. What are the inputs that we would have decided what the inputs are, but things could have happened in regard to those inputs, and the outcomes could be very different. If you had, there could be, I'm going to call it a wild card, like President Trump happening, and it could affect those outcomes. So you discuss that in the pre-meeting with the senior executives, and maybe that would become an agenda item. And then IT governance and cybersecurity. This, of course, is absolutely critical. Of course, the two major risks for business today is climate change and cybersecurity. And do you have an officer which has been audited for competency and integrity, etc., who is a recovery officer when you have actually some leak through your firewall? And if there has been, you need to make that specifically an agenda item. Then something I've discussed in regard to King 5. If I am a clothing manufacturer and listed on the London Stock Exchange, my main supplier of fabric, let's say, is a fabric manufacturer in Nigeria. It's very important that I know what is their state of corporate governance, what is their state of governance, how are they governing? Are they governing as responsible corporate citizens? Are they reducing expenditure, for example, using child labor? Because if that is discovered, and I have costed my product, which is selling in the high streets of London, for example, the next day I could lose up to 50% of my market cap when the stock exchange opens. Now, that's exactly what has happened to some companies. These humanitarian issues you've got to watch in your supply chain. And it's something at a pre-meeting you will discuss. And it's something that either the chief financial officer, someone has oversight over what's happening in your supply chain. Because what happens in your supply chain could absolutely affect the value of your market cap. Then the risks and opportunities of climate change. It's something that has to be discussed. It's something that does affect the company and could affect the company. Let's assume we were in California, for example. We would be very concerned about that, running our business in California at the moment. And I include in climate change the question of nature, because nature is extremely important, especially, let's say, in the agricultural business. You've been laying pesticides down to stop pests eating your crops, etc. But of course, the pesticides also kill other things, like things you don't want to kill, like bees. But they're also, perhaps even more importantly than bees, nothing's more important than the bee. They pollinate and as a result we can still eat. But they do kill earthworms, and then you don't get the aeration of the soil. And when you don't get the aeration of the soil actually becomes unable, you can't grow your crops there anymore. And so these are critical issues which you've got to be mindful of. And then diversity on your board. We've been focused on gender and race, but the importance of the Millennium and Generation Z is something which is stark but realistic. So Generation Z, Carolyn, are young people, let's say, of 23, 24, 25, but they've already got a degree in IT or whatever it is, and they think differently, certainly from me, and even as young as you are, Carolyn.
Thank you.
But they just do. And, experience has taught me that when there is an issue, to discuss that with a Generation Z person, and something will come out that you just... And so you need to get that on your agenda as well, but you need to discuss it with your pre-meeting. And many companies, as a result, have established some call it a shadow board, some call it an advisory board, but it's made up of Generation Z people. And they enter into a contract with non-disclosure agreements, loyalty undertakings, and if they breach that, and you register their names, if you're in England, for example, with the Institute of Directors in England, and if they breach that non-disclosure agreement, confidentiality of issues, well, they will never become a director of a company during their adult life. So there is that way of enforcing it. But it becomes an agenda item, and you can see the agenda today is much more flavorful. I can't think of another word. Than when I started becoming chairman of companies some 30, 40 years ago, whenever it was.
Thank you.
But I think, yes, flavorful, I think, is a nice word. That's flavorful. So, sorry, I took a long...
That's a fantastic overview. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for everyone to put in the Q&A. Really, I can't keep track of the chat. Please chat amongst yourselves, but if you can post it in the Q&A so I can track. I really would like to ask Prof. King your questions. If I can just backtrack right to the beginning. You said you meet with the CEO or the Chief Value Officer or the Chief Financial Officer before the board meeting to make sure that agenda is suitable for that meeting. And I'm assuming that's after the original pack has gone out, or at what is the timing of that meeting? Is it a couple of weeks before? How does that work?
It's absolutely a good few weeks before the board meeting. And because usually you have, in big companies, you have 4, maybe 5 board meetings a year, maybe 6, most. So you've got a good few weeks between each board meeting, and a lot happens in those few weeks. And you need that pre-meeting is absolutely critical, the chairman with those senior managers or executive directors. And even sometimes go and discuss it with the lead independent non-executive director in case you get sick and he takes over chairing the meeting. So all this pre-meeting is absolutely critical in setting that agenda.
And let's just take an example of when you've gone into a new board situation. So you've taken up a chairmanship position of a board that you haven't chaired before. How would you go about setting that kind of rhythm, I guess, in meeting with the new board?
Well, first of all, I want to stamp my authority on the board, and I do it like this. We have an important issue on the agenda, and I will, let's say it concerns an IT matter, and Carolyn, you're on the board, and I know you're an expert in IT issues. I would phone you and say, Carolyn, have you read your board pack? Yes, maybe. Carolyn, when this agenda item comes up, I want you to start discussing it. I want you to investigate. It's a 30-page management report we have on this issue. But I want you to go into it even greater detail. And I want you to talk about and discuss it. Why do I do that? Because I just want the discussion to be at a more informed level. So we come to a better business judgment call, much more informed, than even with the management report. So when it comes to that item, I would say, Ms. Chalmers, and in boardrooms when I chair, I never use first names. I always use Mr., Dr., Professor, Ms. Chalmers, or whatever. And also it just changes the atmosphere in the board. I would say, Ms. Chalmers, would you, this item, what is your view on this item? And then you would prattle away. I say, right, discussion, anybody? Let's discuss this. And we discuss it, let's say, for 45 minutes. And I'd say, well, I think the meeting is inclining to a resolution of ABC. Do you agree with me, Mr. George? Do you agree with me, Mrs. van der Poel? Do you agree with me, Dr. Ping? And so on. I'll go around the boardroom table. Well, each one says, yes, chair, yes, chair, yes, chair, yes, chair. And then I just pick on one of those directors and I say, Dr. Ping, will you please explain to me in great detail why you voted yes?
Oops, on the spot.
Now, Dr. Ping hasn't understood that management report, hasn't followed that discussion for 45 minutes. I tell you, he sits there with a second row of teeth. He's highly embarrassed. But I tell you what does happen, Carolyn. The question of diligence, the question of doing your homework, my board members, it improves tremendously. And not only that, my authority is immediately created in that boardroom.
Yes, absolutely.
And,
thank you.
And they know, and I do it from time to time. I say, just explain to me why. Why did you vote like that? Why? What was your reasoning? And also the question of speaking through me. There's nothing worse than running a board meeting and you actually have two people at the end of the other side of the oval boardroom table. And tables must be oval in boardrooms because you don't want this question of a rectangular table. Mary, sit forward. George, leave. You can't see Mary, you know, and it's the whole meeting. You've got to see and hear because body language is also an important issue. So that's the way, Chairman, that's where I have over the years stamped my authority on a board, and I really control that board and get things done. And they know when we come to action items for matters arising, I'm really going to check that those have been acted upon and what's happened. But I would have discussed that at the pre-meeting as well.
A quick question from Lindiwe on that timing of your meetings, etc. So she's asking, do you think it would, obviously you have to have a pre-board meeting before the pack goes out. And then do you think that there would be another meeting once the pack has already gone out with the CEO and the CFO? And do you view the pack before it goes out?
Absolutely.
You get first sight of the pack.
He is fed all this information from the pre-meeting, and she or he puts the pack together, and out it goes. I might, in going through the pack, see something that, hang on a second, which will cause me to speak to the CFO or somebody, you know, about. And if I think it's something important, then I will raise it at the board meeting. We've got this item. What about A, B, C, D, E, F, G? What about this item? So absolutely, you get the pack and you go through it. There might be things arising, might be things that come to your attention which are not specifically set out on the agenda, but as chair and control of the meeting, you raise that issue and discuss it. It gets resolved.
What happens if something comes up that an urgent? So I'm asking along the lines of what John is asking here. John's asking, would you change the published agenda if something happens to dent, for example, public image in the last hours or days before a meeting, and without any paperwork to inform that discussion? How would you deal with that? So the pack's gone out, matters an issue. Would you put it on the agenda? How would you deal with that?
Even if it's the night before, let's just involves something about information governance. I would phone you, Karen. You're a member of my board, and I would phone you, Karen, and say, this has arisen. Can you just prepare something very quickly, just a one-pager on this issue? And we can distribute that to the board, and we're just on point form, and we will discuss it and try and resolve it. But certainly I wouldn't let it just go by. It's something that's urgent, something that's important, and you have to discuss it and resolve it.
So what that would mean is that I would have to then get in touch with the Chief Information Officer of the organization. How do you feel about board members for an agenda item that's urgent? Just contacting, is there a protocol to contact management in that kind of situation?
Protocol is usually going through the chair. So the protocol laid down is you go through the chair who says to you, Karen, and certainly talk to the Chief Information Officer. Tell him you've discussed it with me and talk to him about it, and just prepare a one-page note so we've got something for us and we can discuss this. It's urgent. We didn't know about it. Fair in the pack. Let's discuss it now at the board meeting. Absolutely.
And just a last thing on the agenda before we move to the actual topics on the agenda. In an agenda, when you have the management pack comes through, and I've been in meetings when it's 1,000 pages that come through to us. And then you have, so management presents a report, as you say, is 30, 40 pages with all of the annexures, addendums, and then you have management come into the meeting and then present on the whole pack. How do you deal with that? It's on the agenda. We know that we needed to discuss it. It's a decision-making item. How do you deal with that?
Well, again, you just, as a chair, you've got a responsibility to make sure it's you raise it, even if you've got nothing before you. You raise this issue, and you make sure you discuss it and try and resolve it at that board meeting. It might mean that you have to think about it and prepare something and call an extraordinary directors meeting, ordinary. But if it's important, you've got to resolve it. I just saw someone on the chat asking me about Steinhoff. I was a director of Joshua Daw, the uncle in the furniture business. And Mr. What is his name? I can't remember. From the German company, from Steinhoff, came and did a presentation together with Joost about how we should merge into Steinhoff, and Joshua Daw would disappear. I was not happy with that at all, and had many questions to answer about it. And the chief executive got very upset about this. But I regard myself as quite an informed person, and when I asked questions, Joost gave answers which were not comprehensible to me. That was disturbing. And I was dead against it. But as you know, a good few years later, I had already left the board, and it actually happened. And I had kept my Joshua Daw shares. They became Steinhoff shares. And like everybody else, I lost 90% of the value. But it's extraordinary that when you think people forget in regard to Steinhoff that the center of Steinhoff was in Holland, in the Netherlands. And they have a supervisory board.
Dual board.
It's a dual structure. And the supervisory board are all the non-executive, with the independent or whatever, but they're non-executive. And then you have the executive board chaired by the chief executive, Joost. So you don't get, and that's why I'm very much in favor of the unitary board, because if you're the chief executive, Karen, and I'm the chairman, we eyeball each other. And I think eyeball is very important. And I also think that unitary board is more important because you've got those who are at the coalface as executive directors and those from the outside coming in are not at the coalface, but they ask the questions about the wood from the trees. And putting all that together, you get a better outcome, I think, than the supervisory board that almost talks about these things in vacuo and not without that coalface in at the board meeting. And that's why, as I'm speaking to you, the question of the dual structure of boards, supervisory board and an executive board, is falling out of favor. And the unitary board is definitely seen to be more favorable from a governance point of view.
And the eyeball to eyeball.
To me, it makes sense that you've got people with outside experiences and obviously certain skills in regard to that business, and so they can invite it on the board and the non-executive director. But you've got people who deal with this on a daily basis, and they're actually at that coalface. And you put that mix together and you mix it up, and out should come a much more informed decision. Yes. The supervisory board actually goes blank. I mean, in Steinhoff, it's very interesting. Joost is a very charismatic chap, and his fun or his weakness in life was horse racing, and he owned, I think, the biggest stable in South Africa at the time. And it was very fascinating to me that one of the non-executive directors, very well known, one of the supervisory board directors, very well known, who I think had obviously seen a horse in his life, but had never in the horse racing business, suddenly bought himself a racing horse and entered into races. So that charisma from the management flowed over into the supervisory board. And so I think it's I don't like the dual structure. I think a unity is much better from a governance point of view.
We've got you're saying, eyeball to eyeball. We've got a question from Ntumba here around the rigidity of the agenda. So if the question is, does the set agenda pose a form of rigidity on what is to be discussed in the board meeting when issues like the previous pandemic arise, which can lead to disruption of the organization's regular performance? So how rigid is that set agenda? And what you were saying in the lead up is it actually needs to be flexible. And I guess that's in the context of the work plan for the year or for the 18 months. And then, all right, so we've got that. You saying the meeting beforehand gives a little bit of flexibility to that. You need to address the matters of the day. But what happens if you get to the board meeting and a board member wants to, or management wants to add an agenda item? How rigid do you need to be?
Not rigid at all. If something happens that is important, you have to discuss it. And if you raise it there, and if you need to, you call another board meeting extraordinary in a week's time, or the next day even, or you sit into the night. I've chaired board meetings when I was the chairman of Straight, when we moved from manual sale of shares on the stock exchange to a digital movement. It was formed by way of a statute. The entity became a person in law through legislation. So it wasn't an ordinary company, and it had a double function. The function was that it would control the trading of shares and also would regulate the custodians who would be holding this electronic share certificates. And the major, the starters of Straight were the JSE themselves, and the four major banks. And they asked me to chair Straight. And I found in the first few board meetings, I was more an arbitrator than a chairman, because there were great debates about the money being put up by the bank and what was happening. And then, more importantly, there was huge debate about the fact that Straight was the policeman, because it policed how the custodians were behaving, and yet also they were trading, and we were controlling the trade. But now we were in one building, and I actually never built a Chinese wall between trading and the regulation. I put the regulators on the fourth floor, and I put the trading business on the third floor. I actually physically separated them. So one day, one of the major banks had, in the view of the executive, breached one of the custodial rules, and they were fined 5 million rand. And I had the chair and the chief executive of the bank in my office screaming and shouting and saying, "This is ridiculous, and we help in the trading." And I said, "I didn't create this. This is created by statute, and here it is here." And what did I do? I decided that the only way to do this, and here comes the question of why you should have as an agenda item these days stakeholder relationships. But the only way to do this was to get a chief stakeholder relationship officer. And he or she, and it happened to be a she that we appointed, we had a criteria. He or she had to be formerly a chief executive of a company, so deep understanding of how companies are run and what happens. And she went around and started explaining how Straight had to work and how the statute was set out and how we should be able to work together. And it took about 18 months to actually get this right. But the chief stakeholder relationship officer actually worked. And a lot of big companies today actually have stakeholder relationship officers that go talk, because you can imagine if you don't have that and you're a big company, a lot of the time of the chief executive or the financial director is spent talking to stakeholders and anything. But if it becomes critical, you phone them and say to the chief stakeholder relationship officer, "Mary, this is what's happened. Will you please go and talk to XYZ customer," or whatever.
And that led to these meetings, the board meetings, way into the night.
It did. One night we sat till 1 o'clock in the morning.
So we do. Prof. King, have we lost you? Or was it me? Oh dear. Hopefully Prof. King can come back. Is it me? If somebody can just put in the chat whether you can see Prof. King. Prof. King's frozen. He's frozen. Okay. So I'm going to carry on. So from what Prof. King is saying in terms of the critical business issues that need to be on a board agenda, in the new board agenda, we've got, and I'm just taking from what he said in the beginning. So stakeholder relations, definitely, and what he's recommending here is that we have a stakeholder officer on the board. And I'm just going to ask you to unmute, Prof. Please, if you can just have a look to unmute, you're muted. I was just recapping. So stakeholder relations is something that the board must discuss.
Yes,
IT governance.
You wouldn't have that person on the board necessarily as an executive director.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you would have that as an agenda item. We need to discuss IT governance and cybersecurity. We need to discuss in the flexibility of an agenda the inputs to outcomes and wildcards. We need to have a look at climate change and nature. We need to have a look at the state of governance of the organization and the board's performance. We need to look at the supply chain. We need to look at diversity. I've listed 7.
That's
Now,
right. And if you look at those seven, Carolyn, you will see that it's not how boards used to operate before.
no.
These are de novo issues. De novo, that's about 10 years old, where, as you know, I lived in aeroplanes and traveled around the world. And in the Good Governance Academy, we've got 180 support members. Universities, business schools, big associations like the Institute of Directors of India, England, and they need to constantly learn about what is happening in the world, and it's changing so much. And now there are companies that have asked me and consulted me about the influence of these geopolitical issues, the impact on their businesses, and how they should raise it from a governance point of view. And this changes of tariffs has a huge impact globally. And so Mr. Trump is really stirring the pot. And
Yes. So that's another matter that goes on the board. So how do you shoehorn all of these things into an already full agenda where you're looking at the traditional board, what do we need decisions for, what are, matters arising from a previous board meeting? How do you put all of that into an already full agenda?
Well, that's the whole purpose of your pre-meeting, is to make sure which is current and what is important. So you actually don't have all this on the agenda. You don't have all these things, the 7 items you've enumerated on your every board meeting, but you have it if it's pertinent at that time in those circumstances because of what's happened to ABC. You have it on the agenda and discuss it and resolve it.
Lots of these questions really relate to some topics that we're going to be speaking about next in our Taking the Helm, and I'll make sure that these topics are actually raised in our series. You'll see that the one that we're having in April is already available on the Good Governance Academy event page, so please join us for that one. I think it's going to be, we're talking about strategic transformations. So that was just that's why I'm not getting to all of these questions here. But so the pre-meeting, to go back to the agenda, the pre-meeting for the agenda and setting the priority items. Now, what we have seen in the press is that boards of directors that have, had motivated for more meetings. The one institution I was involved with and had a look at in terms of governance maturity assessment. Normally what's required is 6 board meetings a year, and this board had 82 board meetings in the year. And it was actually, one has to ask oneself whether it was not just a money-making racket, and things that actually were discussed. So that was now getting into the minutes in the meetings. But from your experience, how do you prioritize these matters? Do you prioritize them, or does everything need to be spoken about?
Well, you actually have to prioritize, because if you just take, for example, supply chain issues, value creation, preservation or erosion, the risks and opportunities of climate change on the company, diversity, stakeholder relationships, inputs to outcomes, IT governance, cyber security. If you take all those things and you put them all on the board, I mean, your board meeting will go for days, can go for days. And I've always said a board meeting should be finished within 3, maximum 5 hours.
How do you do that?
First of all, I find that well, first of all, you make sure that your management reports become clear, concise, and understandable. And as chair, I will keep on rejecting management reports, keep on rejecting them
because
until
you have first
they're
sight of them.
clearly understandable. Because don't assume that that everybody in the boardroom has got an understanding on these issues, and but make them understandable to the average reader. And if you necessarily, companies start developing their own terminology and their own lexicon, and sometimes you need a glossary to the management report. And I don't have that. I'll just send it back, keep on changing the management report. So then the management report comes, eventually they start drawing management reports, and they actually apply their minds to what they're going to put in the management report, and it comes out clear, concise, and understandable. And then I get someone who's got expertise to actually, before the meeting and the pack's gone out, I will phone that person and say, George, whatever his person is, have you read your pack? Yes, and I want you to start the discussion because I want him to add more information. We discuss it and we come to a resolution. But it's got to be understandable, because I can't expect my directors to read something which is in the language which is used every day by the executive in managing. And like you and I use acronyms in talking, which people don't even know what you and I are talking about.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
it's and in IT, of course, we're the worst.
Yeah. So the short answer to your question, you've got to make sure your management reports are clear, concise, and understandable. And there the chairman plays a critical role, because he just keeps rejecting and redraft.
Have you ever postponed a board meeting, or would you postpone a board meeting if the board pack wasn't suitable for the board in time for the board meeting?
Well, I wouldn't let the board meeting start.
You wouldn't. You would postpone it rather.
Because after my pre-meeting, the company secretary would prepare the board pack. And if the board pack didn't fit in with that pre-meeting and the matters we agreed are important issues to be put on the board, on the agenda, and not just plot everything on the agenda and discussion ranging from A to X, instead of focusing on issues. I'd postpone the board meeting and just rearrange it, and I'd have a meeting with those executives and just say, we had this pre-meeting. It's a very important meeting, and look what's happened as a consequence. And that's why, being a chairman is seen as honorific, an honor, but it's actually horrific. It's actually horrific, because you have to deal with things, and sometimes you're seen as a person who is embarrasses you, somebody that calls you out, but you've got to make sure you've got control of that meeting, and the meeting is going to actually come to decisions in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. And that's why in 1992 already I was saying that when I wrote the first King report, the report came out and assumed my name as chairman. Little did I know we'd end up at King 5, but anyway. But I wrote every word of that first report, and it was a huge task. And so what did I learn? I learned to have committees on issues, and then a convener of those. Like King 4, the convener was Ansi Ramala, and she convened the various task teams, and thing which I agreed with her what those task teams should be and who should be on those task teams. And then she collected the information and she brought it to me. And as she said at the time, I was giving her a nervous breakdown because I really had to think.
Deadlines.
And that's how we arrived eventually at the King report. So, and there's no difference in a company. If you get these coming from different departments reports, which are really, you read it, they almost sometimes are non-understandable. Send it back. Just eventually you get your board pack coming, and it becomes a meaningful board pack, and somebody can really discuss and get to the meat of the matter. And then the person I would have asked to really go into it in greater detail, get them to add ideas and discuss it. Hopefully the unified collective mind, we can talk about that another time, unified collective mind comes to a better business judgment call in the best long-term interest of the health of the company, which obviously from time to time is going to benefit one stakeholder more than another, but another time it'll be reversed. So they're going to be trade-offs all the time. And you've got to understand the needs, interests, and expectations of your stakeholders as a matter of fairness. So when you actually make a board decision in the best interest of the company, it's going to hurt one stakeholder more than another, let's say. But when they come crying to you, you can actually explain to them what happened at the board meeting.
You already know.
The conclusion we came to. And I hope you understand that the conclusion. And it's really interesting. Sometimes they say things to you that maybe you haven't considered, and you say, right, we will consider that, and you do. But you've got to make that decision in the best long-term interest of the health of the company. And you can't meet that's why I think it's very dangerous to say we were in an exclusive period during the whole of the 20th century of the primacy of the shareholder, exclusively looked at the interest of the shareholder. And now we're inclusive. Well, if we had to meet the needs, interests, and expectations of all stakeholders, the company would go bankrupt. You just can't do that. So you've got to have a focus on, and your duties of good faith, care, skill, and diligence is owed to the company. It's not owed to any particular stakeholder. And that's why it's interesting that standard setters can choose an audience, perfectly entitled to choose an audience, like the investor, for example. But that doesn't obviate the directors having the obligation to report material matter in the sense that it could influence the mind of the reader as to whether he or she should continue their relationship with the company. I mean, that's your duty. So it doesn't change that obligation. And that's and hence why I think in the ISSB, see, I'm just using an acronym, the International Sustainability Standards Board introduced the principle of interoperability, which has got its own problems because, as you've pointed out, Carolyn, it's a business science term, and it can cause problems when you're dealing with digital issues.
So you're touching on issues. Actually, it's the board discussing certain matters, perhaps the performance of the board, how the board is going to be dealing, acting in the best interest, etc. Do you see the need for, other than discussing or setting a meeting, for other than discussing just the matters that are before it, also discussing how the board itself operates, or is that the same meeting? Is it a separate meeting, or does that come out of the same meeting when you're discussing the matters of the company?
Same meeting, but I certainly, as the chair of a company, when a new director was appointed, I would ask him or her to come and see me, and I would talk to them about how we operate and what we do.
Okay.
And let them have an understanding how I like to run, how the board meetings that we held are run, and why I insist on that being an oval table so I can see and hear each director I don't want to ask this. Lean back, lean forward, speak up, and so I discuss these things with the new director, and they will know how I certainly run that board and how the board operates. And
so it's not a separate
no.
meeting. Do you have on your agenda, is it only matters for decision making, or do you have other matters for noting, just for noting?
Well, there are matters for decision making, but there are matters for reporting on what's happened from a performance point of view, for example. The value you've created in the last 3 months since we've had our last board meeting. That's why I said there are two issues, conformance and performance. And you will always be reporting knows what's happened because they keep moving. You've got to have that on the agenda and report on it.
I could carry on for another hour, but from what I've heard from this hour that we've spent together, in fact, it was more than an hour because some people online had a pre-meeting with us. But what I'm hearing is that the agenda is the accountability of the chair. The agenda is the chair's instrument to control, to manage, to guide. It's the chair's instrument. And so you're not getting the company secretary drawing up the agenda, then that the chair then follows and wears that. Actually, that is the tool. That's the chair's tool. That's their baton. Is that correct?
I think you can look at it very simply, Karen. Is a chair actually carrying out his or her responsibility if he or she allows the company secretary to set out the agenda and what is to be discussed? The answer clearly is in the negative. Chair's just not doing his or her job. And because the chair's got to make sure that the matters critical to the company are discussed, that matters that have arisen and there were action items, what has happened, have you acted on them, have you done them, etc. And so absolutely, Carolyn, you can't just leave it to the company secretary. The company secretary is the outcome of your pre-meeting and everything, and you will actually talk to her and she or he will draft the agenda, and then I okay that agenda before it goes out. I don't just let agendas go out. I like to okay them before they go out.
How much consultation do you have with your other board members about the agenda?
That's the pre-meeting. It can take an hour each person I speak to, maybe more.
So who do you meet with? You meet with the CEO and the CVO or CFO.
No,
you also you engage with your board members on the agenda. Is that a meeting or is that emails? And
if necessary, there might be a critical non-executive director who is particularly informed about a certain subject.
Okay, so then you would
discuss it with him or her and say, we've got this issue, what do you think about this? And I've discussed this with the chief information officer, and this is what we thought, and what do you think? And should we add to it, subtract from it, or whatever? And get his input before finalizing the agenda. So a lot of work, and the pre-meeting is a critical issue. And you finalize that agenda and you approve it, and the end product is really carried out by the company secretary. But the company secretary mustn't set the agenda. I mean, then the chairman is not in control of that meeting. I mean, he's not making sure that the company, the board, the mind of the company is actually thinking about things that are essential to the company, and that's his duty.
Is this the same? Is that attitude the same for the committee chairs of committees of the board?
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for everybody staying online. I have posted the link to our next one, which is on the 17th of April, where we're going to be discussing strategic transformations. Thanks so much for your time, Prof. King. We are indebted for you imparting your wisdom to us, and we're looking forward to the 17th of April. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We will be answering your questions at one of our events. Thank you so much.
Thanks.